The glass walls around the small conference room reflected the cold morning light, giving everything a bluish tint as Diane and James sat stiffly at the table. I watched them from the threshold, their eyes darting to the door the moment they sensed movement. Diane straightened the collar of her blazer, her fingertips trembling just enough to betray her nerves. James swallowed hard, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The air felt tight, pressed down by the weight of what they didn't know yet. I stepped fully inside the heels of my shoes, clicking against the polished floor. Both of them froze. Their faces shifted in slow motion from polite expectancy to confusion to dawning recognition. "Liv," Diane whispered, her voice thin like a wire pulled taut. I slid into the chair at the head of the table. The faint scent of burnt coffee drifted in from the hallway as the door clicked shut behind me. My siblings watched every move I made, like the room itself was tilting toward something they couldn't name yet. "You're at the end of your interviews," I said quietly, letting each word settle like dust on a forgotten shelf. "And they haven't gone well." The silence afterward was colder than the air conditioning humming above us. "Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you." My name is Olivia Hart, and for most of my life, I was the daughter who disappeared into the background. I'm 28 now, but even at 5 years old, I could read the room, could feel how my father's voice softened only for my sister, how my mother's eyes lit up only when she talked about James. I learned early on to make myself small at the dinner table, listening to the clatter of silverware while they traded stories about courtroom wins and law school hopes. My dreams, even then, leaned toward humming computers and pages of code, but nobody ever asked what I liked. They didn't have to. I kept it tucked close, like something fragile I was afraid they'd mishandle. I grew up in a house where every wall smelled faintly of old leather books and polished wood, my father's law journals stacked everywhere like monuments to what real success looked like. Diane followed right behind him. She'd practice her arguments for debate team in the hallway, her voice sharp, confident, echoing off the walls. My father would stand in the doorway nodding with quiet pride. I remember once stepping into the hall holding a science fair ribbon, the cheap plastic still warm from my hand. Nobody looked up. The moment passed like a whisper swallowed by a louder room. James was the golden youngest, the kid everyone liked without much effort. He'd breeze in with the smell of fresh grass from soccer practice, toss his backpack down, and wait for our mother's laugh, soft, warm, unearned. It wasn't jealousy I felt. It was something colder, a quiet understanding that I didn't fit the mold they'd already carved for their children. By the time I hit 18, the computer screens in my bedroom cast long blue-tinted shadows across the walls late into the night. I'd sit there with lines of code reflected in my glasses, while downstairs, Diane and Dad argued passionately about court strategy, their voices rising and falling like a practice duet. I'd listen, my chest tightening with something I didn't have a name for yet, maybe longing, maybe grief. The real fracture came the summer I graduated college. I can still see the kitchen that night, the overhead lights buzzing faintly, the humidity from a late June storm clinging to the air. I sat at the table with a bowl of cold pasta, explaining my idea for a new kind of software architecture. Diane smirked into her wine glass. James let out a soft chuckle, almost apologetic. My father didn't even bother lifting his eyes from the legal brief he was marking up. "Tech startups are a dime a dozen," he said, his tone flat dismissive. "If you want steady work, Olivia, we can always bring you on as IT support." Something in me cooled all at once. Not anger, not heartbreak. Something deeper, like a quiet door closing that no one but me could hear. I remember the clink of Diane's fork against her plate, the faint lemon scent of the dish soap on my hand as I gripped my glass, the way the ceiling fan hummed as if trying to drown out the moment. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just kept chewing that bland pasta until the taste turned to nothing. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay in the lane they'd drawn for me. What they never knew was that I walked out of that dinner already planning the life they never imagined for me, one built far from their expectations, far from their oversight, far from the silent places they kept me in. The snow was falling hard that night, thick flakes drifting under the yellow porch light as I stood on the front steps in my thin sweater. I could still hear the laughter from inside, warm, bright, muffled by the walls that seemed to swallow up any sound that came from me. My fingers stung from the cold as I held the plate of gingerbread cookies I'd spent all afternoon baking, waiting for someone to notice I hadn't been invited to the family gift exchange happening in the living room. Through the window, I watched Diane hand our father a beautifully wrapped box, her smile wide and sure, the room glowing around her like she belonged in it. I shifted my weight, the porch boards creaking under me, but no one turned. Even when I knocked my knuckles tapping softly against the doorframe, the sound vanished into the storm. I remember pulling my sweater tighter, the smell of cinnamon and winter air mixing as the cookies cooled in my hands. I waited there until my breath turned to a thin fog in front of me and I realized no one was coming. And just like that, the memory releases me, though a trace of cold lingers in my chest, the way it always does. The truth is, the mistreatment didn't start when I chose a different career path. It began long before I understood what careers even were, back when the world felt small, and my place in it felt even smaller. From the time I could walk, there was an unspoken order in our home, a quiet hierarchy that touched everything. My father filled the house with the sound of turning pages and decisive footsteps, and Diane mirrored him from the moment she learned how to form an argument. Their voices blended together in a way that made people stop and listen. Mine didn't. I remember being 7 and sitting at the long oak dining table, my legs swinging above the floor as I worked on a school project about constellations. I had glued tiny foil stars across a dark sheet of poster board, the scent of rubber cement still sharp in the air. When I lifted the board to show my mother, she barely glanced up from helping James practice spelling, her hand resting gently on the back of his neck as she praised him for sounding out a word. My board slipped the stars, catching on the table's edge, and I let out a small breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The moment drifted by without touching anyone but me. That's how it always was. At birthdays, Diane chose the restaurant. At Christmas, James placed the angel on top of the tree. At Thanksgiving, my father carved the turkey, while Diane explained her latest academic victory, the room filling with the rich smell of herbs and steam. I learned early that my role wasn't to shine. It was to stay out of the way so their light could fill the room without interruption. Even celebrations had a script, and I was never written into the important lines. I don't think they meant to hurt me, not deliberately. Sometimes, the deepest wounds come from people who never realize they're holding the knife. My parents saw Diane as their legacy, their proof that the Hart family name would continue its march through courtrooms and corporate contracts. They saw James as the heart of the family, easygoing, likable, the one who made people feel at ease. And me, I was the quiet child with the messy hair and the notebooks full of things no one asked about. There were moments, though, when the quiet settled too heavily to ignore. When I was 12, I spent an entire week preparing a presentation for the school's science showcase. I remember practicing in my room, the glow of my desk lamp, casting a warm circle over the handwritten slides I'd taped to the wall. The carpet was soft under my feet as I paced, rehearsing each sentence with care. On the morning of the showcase, I stood in the kitchen smelling toast and fresh coffee, waiting for someone to ask if they should come watch. They never did. Diane had a mock trial competition. James had a soccer scrimmage. My mother's hands were full, making sure they had everything they needed. I went alone. I still remember the echo of my footsteps in the gymnasium, the polished floor shining under the overhead lights. When I finished the presentation, a judge smiled kindly and asked if my parents would be joining later. I shook my head and told her they were busy swallowing the ache in my throat as I packed up my materials. It was there, in that big, empty room, that I began to understand something quietly brutal. No matter how hard I tried, I simply wasn't the child they saw a future in. Over the years, those moments layered themselves inside me, like sediment-thin fragile sheets of disappointment, hardening into something heavier with time. By the time I reached high school, the silence around me was familiar enough that I stopped trying to break it. I focused on my coursework, especially anything involving computers. I loved the soft whir of the school's outdated machines, the way the screen flickered slightly before settling into clarity. I loved the logic of it, the certainty that if something didn't work, it was only because I hadn't found the right sequence yet. Life at home stayed the same. Diane's achievements filled the house with applause. Her trophies lined the mantel, catching the warm glow of the fireplace. James's victories on the field were celebrated with ice cream dinners and late-night cheering in the living room. My mother kept a scrapbook of every medal, every certificate they earned. My father told stories about their successes to anyone who would listen, his voice full and proud. When it came to me, he'd offer a polite nod, a distracted good job, the same tone one might use for a neighbor's child. It wasn't malicious. It was habitual. And habits, when repeated long enough, become truths. The older I grew, the more I slipped into the shadows at family gatherings. I'd sit at the edge of the living room during holidays, my back pressing lightly against the cool window pane as my relatives swapped stories. Someone would glance at me, smile vaguely, then turn away to ask Diane about her internship or James about his travel plans. I'd listen to the hum of conversation blending with the clink of glassware, the scent of pine from the Christmas tree drifting through the room. Sometimes I'd speak up, offering a small detail about a project or a class, but it rarely landed. The conversation flowed around me like a river diverting around a stone, never slowed, never changed. There were years when I believed that was simply my nature, quiet, forgettable, meant to exist on the periphery. But looking back now, I see how deeply their patterns shape that belief. When a child is told indirectly again and again that their dreams are too small, too strange, too uncertain, they learn to tuck those dreams into their pockets, hidden from sight. Mine lived there for years, folded and unfolding in private, illuminated only by the soft glow of my computer screen late at night. The hardest memories aren't the moments I was ignored. It's the moments I tried one last time to be seen. I can still picture the evening I shared with my father, the draft of a small program I'd written. We were in his office. Dark wood, the faint smell of old paper, a desk lamp casting a warm halo over his work. I stood beside him, holding my laptop, heart thudding with the fragile hope that maybe this time he'd understand. He didn't look up. He waved me off with a distracted, "Later, Olivia," before returning to his stack of documents. The sound of his pen scratching across the paper was the only answer I received. That moment stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary, one more quiet reminder that I existed in a different emotional climate than the rest of my family. I grew skilled at stepping aside, at making space, at shrinking my voice, until it barely brushed the air around me. And in that shrinking, I found something unexpected, a drive to build something of my own, something no one could belittle or overlook. Years before I ever sat in that conference room watching Diane and James stumble through interviews, I had already learned the truth that still shapes me. Injustice doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows in the spaces where we're not seen, in the silences where we're not heard, in the rooms where no one looks up when we walk in. And now, standing on the edge of the present, something is shifting. The old hierarchy is about to wobble. A truth is about to rise from the quiet places they pushed me into. The first thing I saw was my name, bold, centered, impossible to miss, splashed across the top of a document I wasn't meant to read. I had clicked open the HR inbox on a quiet Tuesday morning, the room still carrying the faint smell of fresh coffee and that sterile chill that settles over an office before people fill it with noise. A new message sat at the top, the subject line blinking like a pulse. I opened it without thinking. 2 resumes slid into view. One labeled Diane Hart, the other James Hart. Their photos stared back at me in sharp digital clarity, the fluorescent light from my screen washing their faces in a cold glow. I scrolled my finger, trembling just slightly, and saw the positions they were applying for strategic leadership roles, so high level they required years of experience in tech roles I'd crafted for people who'd lived and breathed innovation. My breath caught. A second attachment surfaced below. A formal proposal letter from Hart & Cole Law Group, my father's firm. The language was polished heavy with legal phrasing, but the signature at the bottom, Richard Hart, senior partner, made the room feel suddenly smaller. The sound of the heating vents hummed overhead, too loud, like the building itself was holding its breath. The files kept coming. A text preview from Diane, a reminder email from scheduling, notes from the HR director flagging their interviews for priority review. I stared at the screen, the light stinging my eyes as the pieces arranged themselves with almost cruel precision. They were coming to me. My family, who never cared what I built, never cared what I loved, wanted something from my world. And they had no idea they were sending it straight into my hands. A slow exhale left me shaky and uneven, as if my body were trying to catch up to what my eyes had already seen. For a long moment, I simply sat there, listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock behind me, feeling the air against my skin like it had turned colder in an instant. It took time before I could fully absorb what I had just stumbled into. What I found that morning didn't just surprise me, it uprooted something old and buried inside me. I'd grown accustomed to being invisible to them, but this was different. This was them walking blindly into the very empire they said I'd never create. So I leaned back in my chair, and for the first time in years, I let myself revisit the story behind the person I had become. I opened each file again slower this time, letting every detail press its weight into me. Diane's resume was a polished, confident list of legal accomplishments. She'd left my father's firm, attempted a modernization initiative that fizzled, and now proclaimed herself ready for executive transition into technological leadership. The words smelled of desperation and perfume features that matched my memories of her perfectly. James's resume was softer, scattered with short stints at mid-sized firms, each job ending with carefully neutral phrases like seeking growth opportunities. His optimism was always his sharpest weakness. I read his cover letter twice, noticing the anxious subtext between the lines, like he was finally reaching for something he wished he'd started years earlier. Then I opened the proposal from my father. The paper's digital texture seemed heavier than it should have been, as if carrying the weight of every phrase he'd spoken over the years about real careers and practical paths. Each paragraph offered his firm's services, from corporate contracts to litigation support, written with the same confidence he'd once used when dismissing my dreams. The signature at the bottom still carried that flourish he'd practiced since law school, a small curl at the end of his name that always felt like a stamp of authority. As I read it, I could almost hear his voice, deep certain the tone he used when he believed he was teaching me something. But now, the words told a different story, one he never imagined I'd be able to read from this side of the table. I closed the laptop and let my eyes drift to the view outside my office window. The morning sun filtered through the glass in soft gold, warming the edge of my desk. Far below, the city moved with its usual rhythm, cars streaming like slow rivers, people crossing streets with coffee cups in hand, the distant hum of life rising up through the concrete. And inside me, something old stirred. A pulse, a voice that had been quiet for too long. For years, I'd believed the patterns of my childhood were simply a fact of life, something immutable. I thought silence was survival, that invisibility was the only way to keep the peace. When you grow up unseen, you learn to tuck your victories into hidden places. You learn to build quietly out of sight, hoping the work speaks louder than the people who overlook you. But looking at those files, seeing Diane and James reaching toward my company with empty hands, my father pitching himself to a world he once dismissed, cracked something open in me. It wasn't the applications themselves, it was what they revealed. For the first time, I saw clearly that the wall between us hadn't been created by my silence. It had been built brick by brick through years of dismissal, condescension, and convenient ignorance. I had carried the blame for years, believing I hadn't tried hard enough, hadn't spoken loudly enough, hadn't been exceptional enough to earn their attention. But now the truth shone in a way that was impossible to ignore. They never looked closely because they never expected anything worth seeing, and realizing that hurt more deeply than any childhood slight. The idea of confronting them, of pulling the curtain back, stirred something electric in my blood. It wasn't spite. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity, sharp and undeniable. For years, I'd built an empire in the shadows of their expectations. Now, they were unknowingly walking straight into it. The very thing they dismissed had become the thing they needed. And I finally understood the power in that. My office felt warmer, brighter, as if the sunlight had grown bolder, curling around the room in quiet encouragement. I tapped my fingers against the desk, the wood cool beneath my skin. Every movement felt deliberate, grounded like a slow, steady breath before the first step of a long-awaited journey. It was time to step out of the quiet corners I'd been pushed into. Time to let the truth surface. Time to let them see. I powered the laptop back on the soft hum rising like an overture. The HR inbox glowed again, the files waiting. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being seen. I was ready to stand at the center of the story instead of the edges, ready to let them walk into the world I built and discover the truth for themselves. So I clicked forward, typed a short message to my assistant, and set the first domino in motion, a decision that would bring everything to the surface. The room went silent the second I placed the folder on the table. The soft thump of it hitting the polished surface cut through the low hum of conversation, and all eyes shifted toward me. My father's voice halted mid-sentence, the junior partners beside him frozen with their hands halfway to their notebooks. Behind the glass wall, the skyline shimmered with late afternoon light, casting long shadows across the conference room floor. I slid the folder open, each page whispering against the next as I turned them. Diane stared at me from across the table, her breath catching. James's chair creaked as he tried to sit up straighter. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "These," I said, laying their resumes out side by side, "are the applications you submitted to my company." Gasps broke around the room like glass hitting stone. My father's lips parted, pale and rigid. Diane's fingers curled around the arm of her chair. James blinked hard, trying to process what he was seeing. "And this," I continued, tapping the proposal from my father's firm, "is the contract you came here today hoping to win." The air in the room stilled thick and cold. No one dared move. Let me tell you how we reached this moment. I had spent the previous night in my penthouse, surrounded by soft city light, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, gathering every document I needed. My hands moved with a steadiness that surprised me as I printed emails, highlighted timelines, and placed everything inside a plain black folder. There was something cathartic about the crisp edges of the paper, the faint scent of ink rising as I stacked the pages. For 10 years, I'd hidden the truth of who I was. Now, for the first time, I was preparing to step into full view. I walked into the office early the next morning. The hallways still smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, that sterile scent buildings have before they warm with bodies and voices. In the elevator, the soft hum of the machinery felt like an old friend, preparing me for what was coming. I could feel each floor tick beneath my feet. By the time I reached the executive level, my decision was set today. I would reveal everything. Not just my identity, not just my success. Everything they needed to see in order to finally understand who I had become without them. At 10 o'clock sharp, the showdown began. Diane and James were escorted into a modest conference room, first the kind designed to make candidates forget where the real authority sat. Through the security feed, I watched their postures shift as each interviewer dismantled their confidence piece by piece. The room's fluorescent lights gave everything a harsh, unforgiving brightness. Diane's foundation looked too matte. James's tie leaned slightly off-center. Details I never would have noticed in childhood now told whole stories. When Sarah, my chief technology officer, asked them questions they couldn't answer, I saw Diane's jaw tighten, the subtle twitch of her temple as she tried to hide her irritation. I watched the way James tapped his thumb nervously against the table, a tiny rhythm that quickened each time he fumbled an answer. But the real moment I had been waiting for came at 2 o'clock when my father and his team arrived at the main conference room. The scent of cologne and polished leather clung to them as they entered. My father's voice carried easily through the glass wall, smooth and practiced the same tone he'd used to lecture me at the dinner table years ago. He didn't know I was standing just beyond view listening as he spoke about his firm's capabilities, completely unaware that the Miss Blackwood he was preparing to impress was his own daughter. I let him finish his opening remarks before I stepped in. The look on his face, shock, confusion, disbelief, told me everything. The senior partner who taught me to stay practical suddenly couldn't find the ground beneath him. His eyes darted from my tailored suit to the view behind me, realizing in real time that everything he thought he knew about my life was wrong. I own this company, I said, placing the folder between us. And we need to have a conversation. That's where the showdown truly began. The room felt heavy as I opened the folder again, sliding the resumes toward Diane and James. Light from the window glinted off the plastic sleeves, catching their eyes and holding them there. Diane's breath hitched barely, but enough for me to see. James leaned closer, as if willing the pages to change. "You applied," I said, "to work for me, and you didn't even know it." My father exhaled a sharp breath, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to step back into authority. "Olivia, this must be some kind of misunderstanding." "It isn't," I replied. "This is exactly what it looks like. For years, I'd imagined what it might feel like to finally be the one holding the truth in plain sight. I thought it would feel triumphant, maybe even sweet. But standing there, I felt only clarity. A clean, bright stillness inside me. Then came the twist I had been holding back. I reached into the folder and pulled out one more document, an email chain printed in chronological order. The paper was warm from the printer. The ink still smelled faintly metallic. I placed it in front of Diane first. "You said you never heard about this company until recently?" I said, my voice steady. "But that's not true, is it?" Her eyes flicked down the page. I watched the color drain from her cheeks. Months earlier, long before she applied, Diane had contacted a recruiter. She hadn't reached out to learn about me. She'd reached out to try to use my name. She'd claimed to have deep personal ties to the CEO. She'd claimed Olivia Hart, a longtime acquaintance, had asked her to consider a leadership role. She lied. She used my name to leverage a position in an industry she once mocked, and she thought I would never find out. The room inhaled sharply, as if every person present had felt the same cold wind. My father stared at the email chain as though the words were too bright to look at directly. James's eyes narrowed confusion, turning to something closer to hurt as he looked at our sister. "Diane," he whispered, "why would you say that?" She didn't answer. Her throat tightened visibly, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the papers. But the reveal wasn't finished. There was one more piece. I turned to my father and slid forward the firm's proposal, annotated this time with notes from my legal team. "This contract," I said softly, "includes provisions that would have transferred decision-making control of my intellectual property to your firm." My father blinked, unable to speak. He hadn't read the proposal carefully. He had signed his name to a document that could have taken my life's work out of my hands. Whether it was oversight, arrogance, or desperation, the result was the same. "You almost signed away the rights to my company," I said. "And you didn't even know you were handing them to your daughter." The room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the soft hum of the city below us. Faces turned toward me, not with pity, but with recognition. Recognition of the person I had become. Recognition of the truth that had finally risen to the surface. My father opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, struggling for words. "Olivia." I didn't know. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." I gathered the documents, slid them back into the folder, and stood. The faint rustle of paper echoed in the stillness. My heels clicked softly against the floor as I walked toward the door, each step steady, grounded, certain. Behind me, no one moved. No one spoke. The truth had landed, and the room hadn't yet learned how to breathe again. And as I left that conference room, my conference room, I understood that the balance of power had shifted for good. When I stepped out of the conference room, the door clicked shut behind me with a soft, final sound like a book closing after too many unread chapters. The hallway felt quieter than usual, the air cool against my skin, as if someone had turned down the temperature. I walked slowly toward the windows at the end of the corridor. The city spread out beneath me in soft shades of late afternoon blue. For a long moment, I stood there without moving, feeling my heartbeat settle into something steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't shrinking. I wasn't waiting for permission to take up space. Something had shifted cleanly, irrevocably. And in that quiet, I finally let myself breathe. That breath carried me forward into everything that came next. In the days that followed, my life didn't erupt into chaos the way I once feared it would. Instead, it settled into a strange, gentle calm. The confrontation had peeled away years of noise and confusion, leaving me with a clarity I didn't expect. And in that new stillness, I began to reclaim the pieces of myself I'd tucked away for far too long. My penthouse became the first place I turned to for grounding. I had lived there for years, but always in secret, tiptoeing around it like someone renting a dream they weren't sure they deserved. Now, I opened the curtains wide, letting the morning light pour in warm and golden against the hardwood floors. I scrubbed the kitchen counters until they gleamed rearranged bookshelves and boxed up things that reminded me of the years I'd spent feeling small. Even simple tasks, the feel of cool water over my hands as I rinsed dishes, the soft thud of cardboard boxes closing, felt like rituals of renewal. Each act was a way of telling myself, this is your life, and you're allowed to live all of it. I updated my company records next. No more aliases, no more initials. Every internal file, every leadership bio, every press release was quietly amended until my real name stood where L.W. Blackwood once did. Seeing Olivia Hart, founder and CEO, typed in bold across the screen made something in my chest loosen. It felt like claiming land I had cultivated in the dark, finally stepping onto it in daylight. As for my family, I didn't cut them off with dramatic speeches or slammed doors. I didn't need to. Boundaries, when real, don't need volume. I simply pulled back, redirected calls, answered messages when I had the bandwidth, and let silence arise where their expectations used to go. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't cold. I was just done carrying the weight of being the daughter they refused to see. My mother reached out first. Her voice trembled through the phone as she apologized, pausing often as though afraid the words might break. I listened, letting her speak, but I didn't rush in to comfort her like I used to. Growth sometimes means letting other people sit with their own discomfort. My father sent a long email instead of calling carefully worded formal, in a way that felt safer for him. I answered eventually, gently but firmly, making it clear that any relationship going forward would look very different from the past. And surprisingly, in all that space I created, I found room for people who had been quietly supporting me all along. My assistant Michael stopped by my office one morning with 2 cups of coffee, the steam curling into the air between us. "You did the hard thing," he said, simply. "Don't forget to let yourself feel proud." His voice was soft, earnest. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear it until I felt my throat tighten. Sarah, my CTO, invited me to dinner with her family one evening. It was a small gathering, her kids coloring at the kitchen table, her husband stirring a pot of soup that filled the house with the scent of rosemary and garlic. Their warmth wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind you felt in the quiet moments, in the easy way people passed each other dishes and laughed without glancing over their shoulders. I sat there surrounded by simple conversation, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere without earning it. Rebuilding my life wasn't one dramatic transformation. It was dozens of gentle shifts. I started going on long walks through Central Park again, the kind I used to take before my company grew too big for me to breathe freely. The crisp air stirred the leaves around my feet, and the sound of distant laughter from joggers and families softened the edges of the day. Sometimes I'd sit on a bench near the reservoir, watching the sunlight ripple across the water in broken shards. Those quiet mornings became a kind of therapy, a tether to the parts of me I had lost while building an empire from silence. At home, I opened every window in the penthouse one afternoon, letting fresh air sweep through each room. Curtains billowed, gently carrying the city's late spring scent, warm pavement, blooming trees, faint traces of someone's bakery downstairs. I stood in the middle of my living room as the breeze lifted my hair, and it felt like the whole space exhaled with me. That was the moment I knew I was stepping into a new chapter. One not written by my family's expectations or limited by the small role they assigned to me. One shaped by my own choices, quiet, steady, deliberate. The company thrived, and I thrived with it. But for the first time, success didn't feel like armor. It felt like alignment, my work, my life, my self-worth finally existing in the same place. Months later, my family came to my penthouse for a dinner I chose to host. The same home I once hid from them now held every piece of who I had become. We sat around my dining table sunset, pouring warm orange light through the windows, and talked openly, honestly, awkwardly at times. There were no grand reconciliations, no perfect endings. Just people trying to understand each other after years of distance. And that, I realized, was enough. In the end, the journey back to myself wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I didn't need their recognition to live fully. The life I rebuilt wasn't a triumph over them. It was a homecoming to the person I had long been becoming. And if there's one truth I carry with me now, it's this. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones that happen quietly, in the spaces where we choose ourselves at last.